Right. Well, I would like to welcome everybody to Virtual Voices. I'm Elizabeth Pruch. I'm with the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation, and together with TIDE, Talent Inclusion, Engagement, and Diversity, it's a leadership roundtable. We've put together this series really to talk about race and racism in our community. And this is a free series for folks in and out of our networks and the entire community. We're thrilled that we've got a great audience here, and we'll continue these series as long as necessary and as long as needed, with some objectives, but also with some flexibility. So we thank you for being here. A few quick Zoom reminders before we jump into it. The session will be recorded. We will email this out at the end. Probably by Monday, you'll have a recap of this entire session. We do ask, of course, that you stay muted unless you have a question and are called on. We will mostly be using the chat feature. If you have any questions, comments, resources you want to include in this conversation, we encourage you to light up that chat feature. We will be switching on to speaker view. We would encourage you to do that as well, so you can see who's speaking and any slides that might be there. And if you have any questions about the technical side of this, please reach out to Megan Vivier. She is going to manage that for us on that side. Next up, I just want to do a quick thank you. These opportunities just aren't possible without some of our amazing partners. Molson Coors Beverage Company, Southwest, and TIAA have been true partners through this work and beyond, just with the foundation and supporting all the work that we do. So we thank them. And then a really big shout out to our Virtual Voices Planning Committee. You see their names here. Dr. Michael Benitez, you'll learn a lot more about here. He's going to moderate our discussion today. Tasha Jones, Roberto Montoya, myself, Dr. Tom Romero, Kirsten Vermeulen, and Monica Williams, who I mentioned with TIDE, have really put together what this series looks like and continues to work tirelessly to ensure we're bringing you the kind of information that you are wanting to hear. After this session, we will send out in the recap also a short survey that we hope you'll fill out and let us know what more you want to learn and what you're getting from these experiences. So let me quickly just tee up Dr. Michael Benitez. We are pleased to have this man a part of this working group. He is tapped every day, every moment, locally and nationally. He is a tremendous asset to this work, but also to our community. We are lucky to have you here, Dr. Benitez, and really appreciate you teeing up this conversation. It's going to be more than an hour we'll take, but we are going to fill it in and continue this conversation in other ways in future sessions. So I will hand it over to you, my friend. Thank you all for being here. Dr. Benitez, the mic is yours.
Excellent. Hey, Elizabeth, thank you so very much for your kind words. To all who are here today, Dr. Russ, Jason, thank you so very much for your willingness to participate. I will introduce the speakers here later, but before we get started, I want to do two things. The first thing I want to do is introduce myself. Usa Weyu Watiaudiri, Mike Benitez of Afro-Taino Arawak descent. That means I am Black Puerto Rican, and it's good to be able to learn or relearn some about my native tongue and speak it. In that sense, I also want to acknowledge where we stand. We are in the land here, at least where I am, of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations, amongst others. And it's so important to acknowledge that not only do we occupy that land, but also encourage folks to think more deeply about ways we can not only collaborate, but truly mend and reconcile with Native communities and our Native brothers and sisters. So thank you for that time. And then lastly, I'd like for us to take, about 30 seconds to a minute and just reflect in silence the tragedies that we saw unfold yesterday in Atlanta, Georgia, and that took place in that community, targeting our Asian American, Pacific Islander, or Desi people in general. It's so important for us to think about those interconnections in racism and the way that such white supremacy and racism shows up. That was unfortunate, and my heart goes out to all their families and the communities that were impacted as a result. So just 30 seconds of silence before we begin. thank you all for honoring and for just acknowledging the racialized violence that we bear witness to yesterday, and that we hope we don't continue to see, but that we're also all aware, as we're going to address structural racism today, that while we've come a long way, in some ways, that we still have such a long way to go. And I have to remind people, right, beginning with the first session on how we got here, then the second session that focused on Colorado. The first one focused on the national sort of structural racism, how it all started. The second session really kind of keyed in on what it looked like in the state of Colorado and how we got to where we're at now. Phenomenal across the board, all the presenters who have been able to join us. And today we have another two phenomenal speakers. You know, the thing is that as I introduce this topic, we have to be aware that, you know, America has come a long way in our attempts to better understand and address issues of diversity and inclusion. But we continue to fall short of addressing the systemic practices that perpetuate inequitable outcomes among different groups. But most particular, what we have seen equity gaps close across different sectors or workplace entities. You know, race is one area where we've seen little to no change over the course of the last 60, 70 years. Let's be mindful that the civil rights movement was literally only 60, years ago. But in many cases, and especially for Black communities, it is actually worse today in some areas than it was during Jim Crow and separate but equal law eras, right? And I need us to really sit with that, when we think about the Black community back in the 60s and before the 60s had greater wealth in their communities as a result of segregation, had more autonomy to culturally self-determine how they wanted to show up and live. Even as segregation is inhumane and not the right thing, but it brings to bear this idea of structural and systemic racism that 60 years later, in some cases, some communities are actually doing worse. And at the core of these issues is systemic racism, a sort of form of racism that is embedded as a normal practice within society or an organization. And it can lead to such issues as discrimination in the criminal justice system, and employment, housing, healthcare, political power, education, among other issues and other entities. We see it in the not-for-profit world too. We see it in the communities. And we're going to break this concept down at a high level so we could give an audience today sort of a deeper understanding of the complexities of institutional and systemic bias and how these show up. The audience will leave with tools eventually. Part of what we're going to do is offer tools at the end on how to recognize and work to transform the systems, right? And this includes the long-standing systemic social inequities that again continue to disparately impact members of racialized and ethnic minoritized communities. And before we begin, I'd like to go over some guidelines in particular that I think are beneficial and helpful for us to be mindful about. So, the first one is, as we have this conversation, part of the work is assuming and bringing good intentions to the conversation. And making sure that we're all aware that we do this work and that we're engaging this work because we believe in the importance and criticality of this work to equitize communities and spaces. That we listen generously and with curiosity for new understanding, for new ways of thinking, for epiphany moments, or just those parts that make us see things differently. So listening matters. We have 1 hour, so let's expect and accept perhaps a lack of closure. Part of this work is about us engaging in the education and awareness component of this, though many of us are certainly, available otherwise to, follow through, or if you wanted to follow through. But for this particular moment, obviously closure becomes, pretty difficult. And then let's allow some space for mistakes. I always have to remind people when we do this work, that when we do this work, there's a lot of wounds, there's a lot of trauma. And the same way that you will go to a doctor to take care of an infection, for example, is the same way that you will in some ways treat racism. You don't want to let the wound just continue to stay open. So if we don't allow ourselves for an opportunity or space for grace and for respectful erroring, then what happens is that we begin to unintentionally engage in cancel culture, or we don't provide an opportunity for ignorance to show up similar to the cut, so that we could either cure it or offer, ways to correct it, or mitigate it, or just take care of it altogether. So let's again allow ourselves some opportunity for mistakes, because mistakes is part of the ignorance. And so important is the need for us to always acknowledge the trauma and the ways in which we need to resist re-traumatization, right? The ways that we need to understand that there's quite a bit of mending, there's quite a bit of reconciling and healing that needs to happen. And tied to that, let's be mindful about who bears the brunt of injustice. So even when we have these conversations in civil ways, there are people with the privilege of not having to experience this, racialized atrocities or systemic racial discrimination. And there are people who experience it all the time. So even when we have nice conversations, it's going to hit people differently depending on what their experiences are. So what I would like to do is I like to frame the conversation. I'm gonna put up some slides for everyone. It's gonna take me just about 5 minutes. I'm gonna introduce the speakers, and I'm gonna let the speakers run with the conversation, moderate. I'll be asking some questions, but today we'll be having an informal thematic call and response conversations that allows us to show up genuinely and to show up authentically while also addressing the issues. So I'm gonna go ahead and share a screen. And I want to ask if people can see that screen. Just a nod from someone. Okay, excellent. So I want to begin by offering a definition of structural racism. And it refers to a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various but often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color or non-whiteness to endure and adapt or metamorphosize over time. And so recognizing the system normalizes and legitimizes an array of dynamics that advantage some people over others. And that's such an important foundation to understanding structural racism and what it looks like. So let me offer this slide for everyone to view very quickly. This is what a conversation on structural racism might look like. When I did some research, I looked around, and when you look at different areas of our society, whether it's poverty, whether it's unemployment, whether it's the desegregation of schools as a result of a lack of public funding to the public school system, and the increase in charter schools, or whether it's voting, or whether it's immigration, or whether it's the prison industrial complex system, we begin to see that there are certain groups who are at the bottom and have been at the bottom over time, and there are certain groups who are at the top and continue to remain at the top over time, no different than the continual wealth inequality gap that keeps increasing, not decreasing. We also see, right, how people are showing up with that trauma. To the left here, you see, if you recall, this was an incident about several years back where a particular bike gang in Texas that resulted in fatalities ended up with some scuffling or some arguments, some tension, and it resulted in death. But you have, the guard there with the rifle, and everybody in the back is sitting. Nobody was worried, even though there were fatalities, about any of them, for lack of better words, acting the fool or demonstrating any particular actions of violence. Here to your right, you see a young Black man, hands up, very reflective of the moment, although this actually dates back about 4 or 5 years ago now, where you see literally about 4 or 5 armed personnel all pointing their guns at this person with his hands up. Then we go back to another example, if you recall this case, with a 14-year-old Ahmed Mohammed, who was arrested for building a clock. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Taylor Wilson, a young white man, was recognized and even offered help and encouragement by Homeland Security for building a nuclear fusion reactor. Now, I just want folks to sit this with this as mental and emotional insiders, right? Mohammed built a clock. I need folks to hear that, a wooden clock. Right? He was suspended, expelled. They went through a whole ordeal. Tyler built a nuclear fusion reactor. Right? I'm going to repeat that, nuclear fusion reactor. He got props out the wazoo, was offered help, support, assistance. Nobody thought, wow, a nuclear fusion reactor. What does that mean for this school? Nobody questioned him, which speaks to that structural racism. Then we look at this other graph right here, where we see the impact of COVID-19, particularly among BIPOC communities, who, BIPOC people we have learned over time are in the front lines as essential workers, are more likely to continue to work through the crisis just to survive and not end up homeless or without food, more likely to end up in food banks to feed their families or putting themselves at risk just to keep their jobs. They're more likely to take care of family and loved ones, reside in larger households as a cultural element and aspect of who BIPOC people are, have poorer access to healthcare, and are more likely to have underlying health conditions. So we begin to see this particular pattern, right? And then here, what I present to you, because we're going to get into it later, is going to be the microaggressions, and particularly microaggressions in practice. When we think of microaggressions, there's different ways these aggressions show up, either as insults, invalidations, as assaults, and they all impact BIPOC people differently, depending on the context, depending on the space, depending on what's going on. So when we think about microaggressions, it is the commonplace verbal daily interactions at times. It doesn't mean people are trying to be malicious. Let me be clear. It means that people say things that are just simply biased. Things like, where are you from? Or you speak good English. I can't tell you really the amount of times that I'm asked, where are you from? And then I respond, I'm like, hey, I'm from Denver, Colorado. But that wasn't good enough for them. So they're like, no, where are you really from? Which, I'm cool with, I get it. I'm like, oh, my bad, you caught my accent. I'm from the Northeast. I'm from New York, PA area. But that wasn't enough for them. So then they go to that next layer of, no, where are you really, really, really from? Right? At some point, when you ask a third or fourth time, you begin to feel like, well, where am I supposed to be from? Like, you're asking me, like, I just don't look like I belong from here, even though people of color have been here before this nation, Turtle Island, now the United States, was colonized by Europeans. And then you see other examples there, not to get into it all, but I wanted to offer this framework as we get the conversation going. And then it is the microaggressions that eventually end up being the micro inequities that we see on a day-to-day basis, that we don't mark as racist or sexist, to use to genderize it, but that matters in different spaces, whether that's introducing a colleague with accolades and others by just a name, or leaving people left out of social gatherings just because you thought that they wouldn't like the activity that you're going to engage in, or feeling like your opinion isn't as valued and you have to push to get harder. So I won't go into all of them. I'm pretty sure there are 2 speakers are going to offer plenty in this conversation, but wanted to at least, again, frame this and offer the slides for us to begin to see some sense of what structural looks like visually or alongside each other. So I'm going to stop this share and I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers, and then I'm going to have them, pick up and take off with the conversation. So let me start off by introducing Jason Thompson. Jason Thompson has 25 plus years of experience working in DEI space. He is currently the VP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Western Governors University and has successfully led diversity work in a variety of corporate and academic positions. He has a track record of creating diversity and inclusion strategic plans that are based on the unique characteristics of each company he has served. Jason has worked with the U.S. Olympic Committee and most recently was Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Techstars based in Colorado. Secondly, we have with us, joining us, Dr. Ryan Ross. Now, Dr. Ross is an educator, speaker, actualization coach. He's committed to access equity in the development of leaders. Ryan's professional, community, and social contributions have afforded him the opportunity to be coined Denver's role model for inclusiveness, as well as land him recognition such as the Denver Business Journal's prestigious 40 Under 40 award, being named as an African-American who makes a difference by the Denver Urban Spectrum, a recipient of the 2013 MLK Humanitarian Award from Colorado's Martin Luther King Jr. Commission, and being named as one of Colorado's top 5 most influential young professionals by Covis Magazine in 2014, as well as being recognized as the 2016 Colorado 9 News Leader of the Year. And after 14 years of educational work, Russ transitioned from executive leadership team at the Community College of Denver to take on his greatest professional community challenges to date as the regional manager for mobilization for the Washington, D.C. based American Petroleum Institute, where he's focused on STEM awareness and students and building workforce opportunities in the energy industry for women, minoritized people, and veterans. Honoring his commitment to leadership, development, and community, Russ simultaneously accepted an appointment by former mayor, the Honorable Wellington Webb, to lead the Urban Leadership Foundation here in Colorado, which focuses on diversifying boards, commissions, and C-suites while building the next generation of African-American leaders in the great Denver metro area. So with that said, Russ and Jason, thank you very, very much for joining us. For your willingness. I know you're both very busy individuals, and that you were able to carve some time to be here with us and to share about this work with people. It's really, I just want to express my gratitude. But I really want to start, and perhaps we could start with Ryan and then go up to Jason. Let's start by you sharing a bit about yourselves, your current roles, and in what ways do you contribute to or advance to racial equity work in your respective roles, spaces, and or lives.
Right on. Thank you for having us, and thank you to everybody that's on the call. It's really good to be in a space and time in our country where we can actually have these kinds of conversations. These are the kinds of conversations that that are complex, but for so long happened in all the wrong spaces. And what I mean by wrong spaces, it happened between people like me, Jason, and Dr. Benitez only, right? And that's the that's the choir speaking to the choir. And us and being frustrated about focusing on how we get this conversation out and bolster it and make sure that it happens for and with and around the people who need to hear it the most. And so just kudos to everybody involved in having this conversation. Just to be brief, because I know we don't have a lot of time. Again, I'm Ryan Ross. I serve as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Equity, and Inclusion for the Colorado Community College System. So essentially, I'm our Chief Student Affairs Officer and our Chief Diversity Officer, working in conjunction with our counselor, our Chancellor, Joe Garcia. And so in terms of the equity work, it's what I do every day. My job is really to serve as a thought partner and help guide our system on our equity journey, understanding that, in our system, there's 14 different institutions, 13 different college presidents, a chancellor, thousands of people from a variety of places, students, faculty, staff, vendors, everybody who we work with. And so taking all of that into consideration as we build out what it looks like to ensure that we have a system where everybody thrives, right? And we have a system where inequity doesn't exist, and we're erasing gaps, both in the classroom, outside the classroom, and within the community. And so it's really great work. Really excited to be doing it and have had the opportunity to take the work outside of the system into forums such as this. And yesterday, or I guess that was Monday, we had all 37 or so higher education presidents sign an equity pledge. That work was really led by the ECC Council. It's the Equity Champions Coalition of educators and other folks throughout the state. And so I have the privilege of being able to serve on that and seeing some really great work happen. So excited to be here, excited to get into this conversation, and apologize in advance that it's going to end before, right when you get really excited, it's going to end. But, that means you just have work to do afterwards.
Right on. Thank you, Ryan. Jason, please.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me. As was mentioned, done diversity most of my career, so it's something I feel. And I, someone asked me once, how do you end up in this space? And I remember thinking, I don't really have a choice. And I think that's sometimes what's forgotten about systemic issues around race and gender is I don't get a chance to turn it off. Like, it's not a choice whether or not I have to deal with issues of race. And so I think many times we forget that. And I'm often asked, well, you work in diversity. Wasn't there a moment that made you want to be a diversity officer? And many times I think, no, I didn't have a choice. Like, a lot of times I think people always want to assume, oh, there's this moment where I pulled a gay person out of a fire, and because I pulled him out of the fire, I knew this is where I was going to be. It's more so, no, I have experienced racism on a daily basis through my educational, experience in my life. Therefore, I didn't have a choice. And it's not that I feel bad that I work in this space, but also there isn't these seminal moments which make me think we should now deal with race. We should now deal with different forms of discrimination. It is a process. And I think many times we think systemic, we still think of those as moments instead of, no, it's a process and a system that we're subjected to. And whether you are actively engaging in it or not, it will continue to perpetuate itself. And I'll pause there because I know we don't have a lot of time, but that just gives you a quick overview of Jason. And hopefully as we get into more topics, I can explain how that system works and how we're impacted or benefit from it.
Hey, no, indeed, thank you both. But, we could get right into it. I mean, I think one of the questions I like to ask us to have a conversation around is, I just presented 6 slides for the audience, 6 slides for us to reflect on. Can you offer some reflections on those slides that I presented, just highlighting structural and systemic racism and the inequities and outcomes that we bear witness to as a result?
Yeah, as you're going through the slides, I was just thinking about how hard this work really is, and it was making me think of a study by Lawrence Bobo from Harvard, and and essentially what the study did was it measured what folks thought about where we were and in this equity conversation, and essentially like 60% or 61% of white people said, hey, we're there, we have reached racial equality, we're doing good. Another 20% said, hey, it's right on the horizon, right around the corner. Conversely, I think it was maybe about 40% people of color who agreed with that. But as you're presenting those slides, I'm sitting here thinking about all the things that are happening, all the different experiences, pulling in some personal experiences. And then, I'm like, wow, 80% of the folks in the majority population feel like this isn't an issue, right? And so if that's the case, like if we're looking at that today, I think there's 181, 182 people on the call. If we said, we looked at that in terms of number, that'd be what, 148 folks who would think that we're all good. And so that would leave, just around 30, 35 or so who would be willing to have this conversation. So when I think about that, I think about how hard the work is and how challenging it is to convince this 80% of folks that this is a real issue. Like, how do we move this conversation forward when so many people don't believe that it exists? And they think that things are one-off and then cultures begin to be blamed for the systemic inequities rather than the systems. And so that's just where I went thinking about those slides and thinking about all the things that we see. It just made me think about how many people don't think that this is an issue, and how complex and hard the work is because of that.
And I would add to those comments is that the way we allow you to not think about it is terms like health disparities. For instance, when we see the fact that African Americans are disproportionately less healthy, or what happens is we sanitize racism. So here's my example. We call it health disparities, but we know systematically that African American women, the odds of them dying during childbirth is like 2 or 3 times their white peers, regardless of income or location. And in fact, that death rate during childbirth is almost equivalent to a third world country, meaning that a Black woman can go to any country in the world and the odds of her surviving childbirth is the same. This has stayed with us for almost 200 years. And if you think about it, we have been delivering children since day one, yet the death rate of African-American women has never changed. That is systemic and that is racism, but we call it health disparities. When you call it health disparities, that gives us all permission to act as if we don't know how this is happening and it's beyond our control. Systemically, we've created words even that allow us to perpetuate this behavior. If we showed up in every hospital in America and said, look, you are racist because this outcome we see for African-American women, you're actively engaging in it. We need to stop it. That would be a whole different conversation. People get really uncomfortable. No one wants to be called racist. Health disparities, I can live with. I cannot live with being called racist. So as a result, we don't use that word, which means systemically, we allow this problem to continue by the words we choose and how we're framing a problem. So we use data that says, oh, it's health disparities. And it feels like, wow, that's too big. I don't know what to do. But if I said, you're racist as a doctor, you're racist as a nurse, you would know immediately what to do, and you would become more conscious about your behavior and its impact on patients. And so that's how systemic racism works, is it's even the words we choose, sanitize it, and give us permission to perpetuate it. And you don't have to do anything about it. It just keeps happening, and it feels like it's beyond your control. If we just simply change the words, I guarantee you it would change the behavior, because we all know we don't want to be racist.
Yeah, Jason, I think you make a really good point with that. And when we think about the definitions, it makes me think about how the definitions are just, it amazes me how many adults that there are in this country who should have the ability to Google, to a dictionary, to their educational experiences, to know the definitions of words such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, but yet those words are used interchangeably, out of context, inappropriately, wrong, over and over again. And I think that speaks to the system as well. That's a part of the oppression that comes with systemic racism. Is designed, it's like smoke and mirrors. And we have to get to a place where people get comfortable being uncomfortable. We have to have the courageous conversations, and we have to call things out, because what happens, to your point, when we use certain words, what it does is it creates the bystander effect, right? It makes people sit by and just say, well, this is the system. This is the way things are. And so who am I to change it, right? And it makes me, and to paint a more visual picture of that, think about a lynching, or, just think about a lynching. And so there's one person, who's pulling the rope. How many people are there watching that happen and legitimizing that that's okay, right? And again, that's what structural racism is. When we begin to normalize and legitimize, things that benefit majority culture at the drastic, and catastrophic oftentimes outcomes for people of color. And we see that. So lynching is that's a really vivid example, but we see that on resumes, right? We see it in admissions applications, we see it in interviews, we see it in the way we look at excellence and mediocrity, right? I don't know a person of color who doesn't subscribe to the notion that they have to be the best at everything they do in every room they walk into, that every opportunity that they have is the only one. And if they don't do right, they're going to mess up for the whole culture. Like, what kind of pressure is that to think, and honestly, be quite honestly, for a long time, I felt that way too, going into these rooms with educators and being the only African-American male, the youngest person. Like, so I'm wearing like, oh man, if I mess this up, anybody under 30 won't be able to do this. Or if I mess this up, there won't be another Black dean. And my white counterparts are like, made a mistake, so what? Like, that's a part of the process. And the fact that privilege to be able to feel like, hey, I can make a mistake, moving 100%, and we just learn from it, versus, hey, if I make a mistake, my whole livelihood is on the line, right? Like, that's like the real outcome of systemic and systemic racism, oppression, and that leads to other things such as mental health, right? Like, literally being Black sometimes is driving me crazy, right? And like, you shouldn't have to feel like that in your own skin and with your own identity. and this being amplified across our country.
And I want to add, Ryan, not only messes up your livelihoods, but that pressure and that sense of it's going to mess it up for the next person of color who comes in and tries to do this, because I wasn't afforded an opportunity for a learning moment or to grow. I had to get it right from the very beginning. Meanwhile, it's not the case. And even studies reflect this. When you look at cross-racial comparatives and dynamics. Now, thank you for that. So, I want to offer something or bring up something, and we had a conversation, obviously, some days back as we prepare, but I thought that you both highlighted some really great points. Ryan, you talked about microaggressions and what they really mean to you and the different framing for looking at them. And Jason, you talked about your experience in particular around startups, around what you've been observing and seeing. Can you please both add on to that? I'm reminded particularly right now of the book Strange Fruit, and I'm reminded of the people who lynched bodies, Black bodies, and then were able to still smile, love on their kids, have a gathering, love on each other, right? It was this normalization of something. So that's to say, I want to put it out there that for racism, most racist people, or if not, it's not that they're malicious, it's not that they can't love, it's not that we're saying that they're the worst people in the world, it's that what we're saying around racism, to be racially ignorant or racist doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it means you have some things you need to work through, in particular, because it's been so ingrained into your way of thinking that you don't recognize it when you practice it.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
I appreciate that. I'm trained as a sociologist, so I always think about systems and processes. And when I worked in the investment space, one of the fundamental principle of investment is diversify your portfolio. You never want to be over-invested anywhere. But what's interesting is how it's applied to people of color and women. So if you look in the investment space, only less than 1% of all the investment dollars go to women, and people of color get even less than that, so 1%. Yet 90% of all startups fail, which means they're disproportionately led by white males, and they don't diversify. They're not even following their own principle. You would think, fundamentally, you would think, wow, if these people are failing at that rate, I should give other people a chance. But that's not what happens at all. That it's actually been institutionalized and repeats itself. That risk is only applied to people of color and women. And there was a study done, her name is Dana Kantz. And what she found as a startup, she had her own startup, is that the questions that she got as a woman were different than the questions her male counterparts got. So the questions she got were about risk. The question her white male counterparts got were about opportunity. You invest in opportunity, not in risk. So by definition, the framing that I'm looking at you with and the questions I'm giving you will actually dictate whether or not I invest in you, because no one invests in risk. You invest in opportunity. And so there's two things that's significant there. One, that she figured this pattern out, but two, she realized that if you could actually change your response to the question, it could increase the probability of you getting investment. But the second thing that's interesting she found is that there was a big push to increase the number of women VCs, women investors. It did not increase the investment in women. Why not? Because systemically women were trained by these men. They were therefore asking the same questions of women and didn't realize they were doing it. So the system began to perpetuate itself. So just being in the room isn't enough if I train you to do the same work that I have been doing. And that's what she found, is that the system actually just keeps reproducing itself. That until someone paused and said, actually, this is about the questions we're asking and how we see these people. If we don't change that behavior, we can't increase investment. And it's an interesting dynamic, because on one hand, the fundamental principle is diversify. We don't use that. We see failure. And typically you don't invest in failure, but we continue to use the same process, which is producing failure. Of that 1%, women actually do much better, even though they get less money. People of color do much better. They get less money. And everybody just completely ignores that data and continues to do what they've been doing. And then when we diversified and added more women, their behavior was the same, but it doesn't surprise me, Because how would you get advancement in a system if I don't reproduce the same behaviors that I'm seeing, right? You're not going to get promoted as a VC unless I begin acting like the people who hired me. That's how the system works. So you can see how these things are hard to break because, even if you don't know it explicitly, you know it implicitly. The best way for me to get a promotion is to mirror the behavior of the person who hired me. If you do not do that, you typically don't get promotions. So
and you bring up, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jason.
No, it's just to say thank you. I'm done. Go ahead.
No, you bring up a great point though that I just want to mark because it matters, and that's the way that language and discourse is used to veil racism, even when we don't mark it as racist tone or racialized undertone.
Yeah, because I think most investors would not say I'm racist and I just practice on a daily basis, but they never have to think about that behavior, right? It just reproduces how I ask questions, who I ask them of, what's taught to me, I reproduce it. It doesn't seem like a system. I'm just doing how we define success.
Right on. Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, and so you just talked about words, right? And so when we talk about microaggressions, I really pause and I think about that because when you think about the definition of aggression, right? It's hostility, it's a violent action towards someone, a readiness to attack. And the reality is I don't believe that most people wake up to be violent or want to attack somebody. So a lot of these things are not intentional. But when we think about these microaggressions, for me, I focus. So when you look at the word, there's privilege in the word, right? Because it focuses on those folks who are doing it, right? Oh, these are small acts of violence. These are small things, right? But we don't focus on the other side of that, the folks who are experiencing it. And so for me, it's not a microaggression. It's abuse, right? It's macro abuse. It's death by 1,000 cuts, right? Every time you leave your home as a person of color and you experience the day for 12 hours, right? And you have these interactions, I think about, I use myself as an example, right? Whether, I leave my home and I go shopping at, well, now it's a big one. I go downtown and if I'm not in my bow tie kind of uniform, which I really love to wear, but if I'm just chilling and I see a white person, almost, I would say 50, 55, 60% of the time, I'm asked if I know where to find weed, even though there are dispensaries everywhere. I mean, like Google it, right? So what happens is you have these experiences over and over and over and over and over. Like that's abuse. That's what creates this trauma that we experience and we show up and people don't think about that. They think like, oh, well, I didn't really mean to say that, and it, wasn't my intention. But what you have to understand is, again, that's privilege. Privilege is allowing somebody to say, "How I just did something one time. It's not a big deal," right? What people aren't recognizing is you're a part of something that is happening thousands of times to people over a period of time, right? And that has an impact. That affects people's confidence. It affects how they show up, right? And then also when we think about these microaggressions, right? We forget about the power that they have, right? Because the microaggressions are founded in bias, right? But let's go back to, I'm an educator, so let's go back to school. You have a teacher who looks at a preschool or kindergartner who's super chatty. Right now, that kid who's super chatty is now being labeled as hyperactive or bad behavior, right? Now that kid may not get the recommendation to go into the gifted and talented program because somebody's bias has said that they've got bad behavior or they're hyperactive, not that they're an amazing storyteller because they come from a culture and a background where that's how they express themselves, right? Rather than saying, man, that was a really powerful story. That was a really great tool. This student can express themselves. Same thing, there's so many examples. And so I just think that, when we don't have these conversations in the right way, when we don't just acknowledge the truth, right? That privilege is real, that systematic racism is real, bias is real. When we don't do that, we start subscribing to this notion that, hey, all you need is hard work, right? Hard work only is gonna make you successful. And when we do that, that minimizes the systemic problems that we have, right? And then we also have to recognize that implicit bias has negative consequences, right? Because somebody in power, their bias can literally shift the trajectory of somebody's life, right? So going back to that, what I opened with, when we're looking at how many people think we've already reached racial equality, what ends up happening is their perception becomes rejection of the consciousness we need to actually have these real conversations to address systemic racism, because systemic problems have to have systemic solutions, not individualistic solutions. And I think that's another place, that's another conversation, but we get so caught up on the individual rather than the system. And so we move a bad apple out and we open up a space for anybody else to come in. It could be a worse apple, right? Rather than looking at the system and disrupting the whole thing and creating a new culture, how the apples show up.
Hey, thank you, Ryan. And as you know, I saw a question come in, but I want to frame it larger. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask that question. But first, I want to say someone put up Ijeoma Oluo's Want to Talk About Race. I think that's one of the most phenomenal books on the topic out there for anyone interested. So I want to mark that. Thank you for putting that out there. And one of the questions that came in is, as a privileged white male who wishes everyone had the opportunities that I have, what's the most important thing I can do to act on my intentions, and how do I model this for my children? However, I want to take that question and turn it into a bigger question, if that's okay. And that is, what suggestions do you both, or might you both, have for white people in particular who think they're advancing racial equity agenda, but they continue to enable racism through either a savior syndrome or just and you spoke to this a little bit, the both of you, an inability to understand what it means to share power gained as a result of racism and intergenerational wealth?
Big question.
Mm-hmm.
Jason, you gonna go first?
I can. I'm a lover of words and complicated problems. And so I'm also dyslexic. So it's a unique combination to have, because words are difficult, but at the same time, I just love these difficult combinations. And I think one of the things we often don't want to do is look at ourselves as bad people. Like, you think about it, you get up, no one thinks, oh, I'm racist, and today my goal is to discriminate. But you do enter a system every day that reproduces this privilege. And so many times, it means we have to look at things that are complicated, even though they don't feel like it, but like, what is the privilege that I bring? And there's so many different nuances of our day that do that. And so we need to ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. Is, if I get to work and look around and no one looks like me, there's something going on here. Like, how is it possible that no one looks like me? And I used to work in Boulder for a little while, and I decided to count how many days could I go without seeing another brown face. I easily could get to 30 days. I stopped counting because it was so depressing, because if I didn't come home, I would never even see a brown face. Like, there's simple things that you can just do to raise your consciousness about, wow, there must be something going on here. And even in simple exchanges, for instance, I always say, we like poor people to suffer. And people say, well, that sounds horrible. No, we don't. Well, think about it. If you're in the line at the grocery store and the person in front of you pays with food stamps, it makes you mad if they're buying brand name foods, right? Why don't they, you want to dictate to them how they live their lives because they're on food stamps, like somehow they owe you something. And I found myself doing that. Like I said, I was like, and then I thought, wow, what does that say about me? A lot of times we think about systemic racism like, oh, it's everyone else. And no, actually, we should just do a lot of self-evaluations, the words we choose, how we define problems, how we look at other people. Because if I say, oh, I just want poor people to suffer, that sounds terrible. But if I say, they need to be better at budgeting, honestly, you're on food stamps. You don't need to buy the most expensive macaroni. Like, I feel like empowered to tell people what to do with their own macaroni. But what does that say? And it says nothing about them. It actually, the words I'm choosing are reflecting a bias that I'm carrying around. And many times, and I think we could all do this. Like, we like it better when you're racist. We don't like it when I have to look at my own behavior and how I'm perpetuating, these biases on the rest of the world. And that would be my thing that I would tell people is, do self-evaluation, do it regularly. Encourage your kids to do the same thing. Like, when you walk into spaces, you look around and say, wow, no one even looks like us. How's this possible? Or walk in and say, well, everybody looks like us. How is this possible? Like, these things typically are not random. They typically are, that's what systems produce. Like, you go to a school and there's no diversity in school. That's not by accident. As much as we like to think it's not by accident, these things are actually intentional and purposeful. And so that uncomfortable conversation with ourselves that we have, and begin doing even simple analysis of how I look at poverty. And my assumption is because you can't save, or that why would you live on a reservation? It's terrible there. Why don't you just move off? Well, the fact is, it ain't that easy just to get up and move. Like, poverty is a difficult situation to get yourself out of. And so I would really encourage you to do that analysis, the words you choose, and just having this awareness of the spaces that you find yourself in.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just to add to what Jason was saying in terms of his point, a good friend of mine, Jeffrey Cass, he writes on a topic, a concept that he calls ending racial distancing. And I think that's one thing that people really need to consider and think about when you look around, whether it's work, whether it's home, your personal life, where you worship. If everybody there looks like you need to stop racial distancing. You need to embrace other people, other culture, and embrace other narratives, right? Like, there's nothing more powerful than a narrative. After you understand where somebody's coming from, you get to then have a paradigm shift in your thinking. So that's the, for your personal lives, that's the first thing that I would say. And then, as it relates to systems in general, I think that we have to recognize and understand that systems are living, right? They actually are alive. And most people don't think about it like this, but the way you know that they're alive is because they're shifting, right? Like, let's take redlining, for example, right? We looked at redlining and we're like, okay, we're going to end redlining. And so what did we do? We just got more creative. So first there was no access to money. Now we're going to give you money, but we're going to do these subprime loans, right? And now we're going to penalize you to get the money. And so, like, but that's the way the system works. And so when we're thinking about what can we do, it's actually looking at the systems and addressing, I think for me, there's 5 areas. There's plenty more, but for me, I think the top 5 are housing, education, the criminal justice system, mass media, and wealth. Yeah, those are 5. And so it's looking at all those. So from an education standpoint, right? How's funding happening? It's largely based on property taxes. Well, we know that's inequitable already. If you live in Vail, your school's going to be better than if you live in East Denver based on property taxes. So then that shouldn't be the funding formula. So if you are a business person, or if you're in the politics, this is the question you ask your elected official. This is what you hold them accountable for, right? When we're looking at our jobs and our organizations, right? Let's just stop and let's open up our operations manuals and our procedures and look at them with an equity lens and say, is there anything in this policy that stops someone from thriving? If it does, we need to change it. Like, this isn't, and this isn't about a person now, right? Now, this is really about the system. And then I think the last thing that I'll share is the data, right? Peel back the layers, disaggregate the data and look at every aspect of the data. Don't just take the easy way out and say, oh, 90% of what we're doing is great. Well, there's 10%. What does that 10% mean? Who is that 10% affecting? And we have to apply humanity to our data, right? Like, everything can't be a bottom line business money driven decision. We have to look at the humanity in a lot of our data to say, okay, in this 10%, this particular group of people isn't thriving. These folks during COVID can't get the PPP loans. These folks don't have the same access to paperwork, or these nonprofits can't do the research and data because they're busy doing the work. So how do we look at this? I think to Jason's point, when we talked before, right? The job descriptions, are we looking at potential, or are we looking at screening people out because they don't have a certain degree from a certain region or a certain, right? So it's actually looking at the systems and the things that create barriers and eliminating those things. So I'll stop there. I know we got a few minutes left.
Hey, thank you so very much. I'm gonna ask one final question. If you can both, just take, just a minute to respond, and then I'm gonna pass it over to Elizabeth. But I'm so grateful for the conversation and for what you're highlighting, and the praxis that you're offering folks. I just put on the chat for the audience just some different studies, and particularly for industry and employers, that demonstrate the way racism shows up in the hiring process, in the income process, and different parts of the industry and other corporate spaces in particular, and that's for folks to take with them. But my final question for you is, or for the both of you, is what, if any, resources of tools might you have that you can share with the audience to help them address some of these issues in their respective spaces?
I can go real fast. I'm not a deep thinker, so it's pretty easy. One of the things I always say is we actually reproduce inequities by how we pay people. If you get a pay, I always tell these people to do this. You get a pay window, typically when you can make an offer, right? Typically HR says, okay, hire the manager, here's the window, and typically want to hire at 50%. And I would say you should actually hire women and people of color at the 90th percentile. Why? Because we know they're systematically underpaid. If you hire them at the middle, you just actually reproduce the discrimination which they know they're suffering. And you individually have an opportunity to do so. So you should. That's actually a place you could actually make a decision that makes change. Because if you only allow that 50%, you just reproduce what's already existing, like you're actually contributing to the system. So that would be a simple thing. And data usually is a good indicator of things. So if you see hiring patterns, use that to address hiring patterns. And the last thing I'll say, because I like the study, is do not redact resumes. My name is not the problem. It is you that is the problem. That's where racism lives. That's the first response. Oh, we have these black names. We need to get rid of black names. No, no, no. You are the problem in how you're responding to black names. That's where racism lives, in you, not in resumes. They don't need to be redacted. Don't whitenize me. It's okay to be black. Deal with humans. That's where discrimination lives, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jason. Ryan.
Yeah, so I'll just, couple quick things. So the first, start with yourself, right? Change your thinking, change your life, and change your thinking, you can affect everybody else's life. So start with your own mindset. Do some education, do some reading. Right now, it's a real popular book, but I like it because it's raw and it's in your face. But Ken Dee's How to Be an Anti-Racist is a really great read. You may not agree with everything in it, but it's going to make you think. And I also like it because he uses definitions at the beginning of every chapter. Again, you may not agree with every definition, but it'll make you think, and doing things like that. Second thing, in terms of working on yourself, is having these conversations. Start having these conversations. We all know there are people in our families and our groups that these conversations trigger things and make people uncomfortable. That's cool. Trigger people, right? Black folks have been triggered for over 400 years. You can be triggered for a 30-minute conversation. I know that sounds rough, but it's real. Like, let's have it. People who are in oppressed communities, their experiences are always triggering. So you can be triggered by a conversation. The other thing then is, again, policies and procedures. Pull them out and review every one of them. Look at every policy and procedure that you have and see if someone's not thriving. I mean, this isn't rocket science. You can look and say, does this do that? And then two final quick things. Remember that success and oppression rolls downhill, right? So when you think about slaves who were picking cotton, and slave owners were getting rich, so their families are arguably now rich, and those folks picking that cotton are arguably still poor, right? And so we have to rectify the sins of slavery, Jim Crow, and all those kinds of things. We just have to look at them. We have to admit that they happened, and we have to begin to look at how we do those things. And we may not have the answer, but the conversation is going to be important. And so I'll stop there. And again, thank you guys for your time. And I hope we gave you some stuff to think about.
Ryan and Jason, to you, gratitude, absolute gratitude. Thank you so very much. I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Elizabeth to wrap it up, but truly appreciating your words of wisdom and the practicality behind them. Thank you for joining us.
I want to second what you've said, Michael. A thank you to you, Michael, Ryan, and Jason. I mean, the chat feature says exactly it. Incredibly powerful. This is a topic with a lot to unpack. We will continue to do that through these Virtual Voices sessions. We have 2 more coming up, well, every month. But the 2 that we have teed up right now, we're going to really highlight women of color and what this topic of systemic racism has meant for them, their experience, and what it feels like. And then we're also going to look at put your power where your mouth is. If you were part of our first session, Monica Williams, she really dropped that on us, and really looking at, don't just put your money where your mouth is, but put your power where your mouth is. And how can our CEOs and our leaders really impact this change that you got to hear about today on how to kind of start thinking about it. So We hope to see you at future Virtual Voices. Again, thank you deeply, deeply for your participation today. And to Jason, Ryan, and Michael, we appreciate you and your time, and we will hope to see everybody soon. Thank you for being part of Virtual Voices, guys.